Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and the Murderer Who Could Not Exist, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Murder That Should Not Be Possible. The rain lashed against the stained glass windows of Blackwood Manor, a relentless storm, swallowing the night in sheets of thunder and howling winds. Inside, however, there was only silence, a heavy, unnatural silence that settled over the grand estate like a shroud. At precisely 11:47 p.m., that silence was broken by a scream, a single, piercing wail that echoed through the dimly lit hallways before cutting off abruptly. By the time anyone reached the locked study, the horror had already unfolded. The door was bolted from the inside. No windows were open. No secret passages led in or out. And yet there, slumped over his mahogany desk, a glass of untouched brandy by his side, lay Lord Reginald Ashford, the master of Blackwood Manor. His lifeless eyes were frozen in an expression of shock, his mouth slightly parted as if he had died mid-sentence. A single gunshot wound marred his temple. The pistol, an ornate antique that had belonged to his late father, lay on the floor just out of reach. Hercule Poirot arrived precisely 30 minutes later. The storm had delayed him, the winding roads leading to the manor treacherous under the weight of the rain. He stepped into the grand foyer, his sharp gaze sweeping the gathered household. There was an air of tension, no grief, not yet, only disbelief, fear, suspicion. They were waiting for him to tell them what had happened, as if his mere presence could explain the impossible. He allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. "The body," he murmured. "Take me to him." Inside the study, Poirot took in the scene with precise, deliberate movements. The smell of gunpowder still lingered faintly in the air. A large grandfather clock in the corner continued its rhythmic ticking. Indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded in its presence, the desk was undisturbed, save for the dead man slumped over it, papers neatly stacked, a pocket watch stopped at exactly 11:47 p.m., a locked door, a body, a weapon that no one could have used. The others watched in uneasy silence as Poirot moved with meticulous care. He kneeled beside the pistol, but did not touch it. His keen eyes traced the trajectory of the wound. His fingers hovered over the brandy glass, the ink-stained papers, the small brass key in the dead man's grip. Then, with the lightest of touches, he pressed against the door. Solid, unmoved, unbreakable. He straightened and turned to the room's occupants. "You heard the shot, yes?" They nodded. 5 of them, standing in a hesitant semicircle. Lady Eleanor Ashford, the widow, her face pale and unreadable beneath her mourning veil. Victor Hughes, the family solicitor, his fingers drumming against his pocket as though suppressing a nervous tic. Margaret Sinclair, the housekeeper, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pursed. Henry Ashford, the estranged brother, his sharp eyes betraying little emotion. And Florence Green, Lord Ashford's personal assistant, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. Lady Eleanor was the first to speak. "We were in the drawing room when we heard it. We rushed to the door. But it was locked. We couldn't get in. Not until the butler fetched the spare key from the east wing. Poirot's gaze flicked toward the deceased's hand, still curled around the small brass key. The door was locked from the inside, he said, more to himself than to the others. And no one saw him alive after dinner. Margaret Sinclair shook her head. He dismissed the staff early tonight, said he had personal matters to attend to. I was the last to see him at 9. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed. And yet, someone entered this room after 9 and never left. A hush fell over them. The storm, outside, raged on, the wind wailing through the old estate, as if mocking the absurdity of it all. A murder with no killer. A crime that should not be possible. Victor Hughes cleared his throat, his voice strained. Are we certain it wasn't? He hesitated. Suicide? Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. No, he said simply. Suicide is a conclusion one reaches when no other possibility remains. And I do not believe we are there yet. His mind moved through the details with ruthless efficiency. The locked door, the untouched brandy, the position of the pistol, too far from the victim's hand to be a self-inflicted wound. The stopped pocket watch, the silence before the gunshot. Every detail was a puzzle piece, scattered, waiting to be assembled. Poirot turned to Florence Green, who had remained silent thus far. Mademoiselle, you were his assistant. Did Lord Ashford seem troubled these past few days? Florence hesitated. A flicker of something unreadable passed over her face. He had been tense, distracted, but he didn't confide in me. Poirot did not believe her. Not entirely, but he let the matter rest. For now, there were bigger questions. Inspector Caldwell will arrive shortly, Poirot said, his voice quiet but firm. Until then, no one leaves the manor. Someone in this house holds the answer to a question that should not need asking. How does a man die in a room that no one could enter? The grandfather clock struck. Midnight, its chimes deep and foreboding. And somewhere in the manor, beyond the reach of flickering candlelight and uncertain whispers, the truth lurked in the shadows. Waiting, Chapter 2. The victim who left no trace. The rain had slowed to a dull drizzle, leaving a thin mist hanging over the manor grounds. The scent of damp earth clung to the air, thick and heavy, as Hercule Poirot stood over the lifeless body of Lord Reginald Ashford. He had seen many deaths in his time, but there was something about this one, something unsettling. Not just the impossible nature of the crime, but the feeling that something fundamental was missing. Poirot could sense it, like a whisper in the air, an unanswered question that had not yet formed. The others stood in uneasy silence, watching him. The body had been examined. The locked room mystery still loomed over them like a storm cloud refusing to break. Yet, as Poirot studied the crime scene once more, he felt an unexpected sensation creeping into his mind, an unease that had nothing to do with the method of death, but the victim himself. There was a strange absence, something elusive and wrong. Poirot turned abruptly to Inspector Caldwell, who had arrived moments earlier, his uniform slightly damp from the rain. The inspector was a broad-shouldered man, practical and gruff, with the air of someone who had seen too many crimes to be easily impressed. Yet, even he looked puzzled. "Tell me, mon ami," Poirot said softly, his voice edged with something unreadable. "Have you confirmed the victim's identity?" Caldwell frowned, glancing toward the corpse. "Lord Reginald Ashford, of course, the owner of this estate, married to Lady Eleanor, brother to Henry Ashford, wealthy, well known in these parts. What are you getting at, Poirot? Poirot's gaze did not waver. And yet you have not asked for any official records, non? Caldwell hesitated. We don't need to. Everyone in this house knows who he is. Ah. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. And yet tell me, who was Lord Reginald Ashford? What do we truly know of him? The question hung in the air, and a chill passed through the room. Lady Eleanor stiffened, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Henry Ashford scoffed, a sharp, humorless sound. Victor Hughes, the solicitor, looked down at the floor, while Florence Green, the personal assistant, swallowed hard, but remained silent. Poirot allowed the moment to stretch before stepping forward, his eyes dark with thought. Perhaps I am mistaken, but something does not sit right. When a man dies, his life leaves traces, documents, letters, photographs. But tell me, where are the records of Lord Ashford's past? Caldwell exhaled, clearly irritated. Poirot, the man is dead in front of us. Isn't that proof enough that he existed? A slow, knowing smile touched Poirot's lips. Ah, but existence is not merely defined by a body, mon cher. It is defined by the imprint one leaves upon the world. Tell me, Inspector, what if I were to tell you that I could find no records of Lord Ashford's birth? No official papers of his inheritance, no business dealings, no signed contracts, no letters addressed in his name. Silence. Lady Eleanor took a step back. That's absurd, she whispered, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Poirot turned sharply to Victor Hughes, the solicitor. Monsieur Hughes, you have handled Lord Ashford's affairs, non? You must have legal records proving his identity. Yes? Victor hesitated, just for a second, but Poirot saw it. Yes, of course, the man stammered. There must be papers somewhere. I have managed his accounts for years. And yet, Poirot interjected smoothly, when asked to present them, you hesitate. Why? Victor's mouth opened, then closed. His face had gone pale. Poirot turned, his sharp eyes sweeping the room. Do you see it now? A man of wealth, a man of title, a man of standing. Yet he leaves no shadow, no record, no proof beyond the memories of those who claim to have known him. And so, I ask again, who was Lord Reginald Ashford? Florence Green let out a soft, strangled sound. It was not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. A sound of realization. Horror. Henry Ashford was the first to react, his voice sharp. This is ridiculous. I knew my brother. He was real. This is some game you're playing, Poirot. Poirot tilted his head, considering. A game, you say? Or perhaps the only truth you do not wish to face? If Lord Ashford did not exist, then who was the man who sat at this desk mere hours ago? And more importantly, why was he murdered? A knock at the door interrupted the rising tension. A uniformed officer entered, looking confused. Sir, he said hesitantly, addressing Caldwell, we checked the town hall records as you requested. There's nothing, sir. No birth certificate, no marriage records, no tax records. It's as if Lord Reginald Ashford was never legally recognized at all. The silence was deafening. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. And so, mes amis, we must ask a new question. Not who killed Lord Ashford, but rather, who was he pretending to be? Lady Eleanor let out a breath, as though she had been holding it for far too long. Victor Hughes looked as though he might collapse. Margaret Sinclair, the housekeeper, was trembling, though whether it was from fear or something else entirely, Poirot could not yet say. The revelation had shifted everything. The locked room mystery had been a puzzle, but now it was a phantom case, a murder of a man who, by all official accounts, did not exist. Poirot turned back to the body, his sharp mind already leaping ahead. The truth was there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered, but one thing was certain. Whoever the dead man truly was, his secret had been worth killing for. And that, above all else, was the most dangerous mystery of all. Chapter 3. The Witness Who Saw Nothing. The night hung thick with a suffocating stillness, the kind that settles in the moments after something terrible has happened. The air inside Blackwood Manor was heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Poirot stood in the grand study, his keen eyes sweeping across the gathered faces, searching for cracks in their carefully constructed expressions. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the glass panes, like a restless spectre trying to force its way in. It had been an hour since Lord Reginald Ashford had been found dead, and now there was a new problem. A witness had stepped forward, someone who claimed to have seen the impossible. Florence Green, the dead man's personal assistant, sat trembling in a high-backed chair. Her fingers were laced together, white-knuckled, twisting in her lap as though she were trying to hold herself together. Her dark eyes darted around the room, never landing on one place for too long, as if the walls themselves might betray her. She was the only one who had spoken up, the only one who had dared to say that she had seen something when the gunshot rang out. But there was something off about her story. Poirot observed her carefully, his sharp gaze dissecting every detail of her demeanor. Fear. But was it fear of what she had seen, or fear of being caught in a lie? Inspector Caldwell cleared his throat. "Miss Green," he said, voice clipped, impatient. "You said you saw the murder happen? Tell us again. This time, from the beginning." Florence nodded, though the motion was shaky. She took a breath, forcing herself to be steady. "I was walking past the study when I heard voices inside. It sounded tense. I paused outside the door, just for a moment, and then I saw him." A hush fell over the room. Poirot narrowed his eyes. "You saw who, mademoiselle?" She swallowed hard. "The killer." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Poirot's face, but he said nothing. Caldwell leaned forward. "Describe him." Florence opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her breath hitched. She hesitated, a look of pure dread flashing across her face. "I don't know." Caldwell frowned. "What do you mean you don't know? You just said you saw him." "I did," she whispered. "I saw someone standing over Lord Ashford's desk, a dark figure holding a gun. I saw the moment they pulled the trigger." She shivered, her voice cracking. "But when I looked again, there was no one there." Silence. A long, stretching silence that pressed against the walls like a suffocating fog. Poirot tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, his expression unreadable. "You claim to have seen a man commit murder," he said slowly. "But the moment you looked again, he was gone." Florence nodded, her breath unsteady. "A ghost, then?" Caldwell scoffed. "You're telling me a phantom pulled the trigger." "I don't know what I saw," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, edged with something desperate. "I swear to you, I saw someone standing there. I saw the gun. I saw Lord Ashford fall. But the moment I blinked, the room was empty. There was no one there. The door was still locked from the inside." The weight of her words settled uneasily over the room. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Miss Green, he said, his voice gentler now, coaxing, tell me this, did you see a face? Florence hesitated. No. A silhouette, perhaps? A height, a build, anything distinguishing? She shook her head. Just a shadow. A presence. Poirot's sharp mind was already moving, piecing together possibilities. Either Florence had witnessed something that defied logic, or she was lying. But why? To protect herself? Or someone else? Henry Ashford let out a cold laugh, breaking the silence. Well, that settles it, he said mockingly. The murderer was a ghost. Case closed. Caldwell shot him a glare, then turned back to Florence. You expect us to believe that? I don't expect anything, she whispered. I only know what I saw. Poirot studied her, weighing her fear against the implausibility of her claim. He had seen many liars in his time, people who could weave intricate falsehoods without a flicker of hesitation. Florence was not one of them. If she was lying, she was doing a very poor job of it. And yet, the truth was just as impossible. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the study, his mind racing. Let us consider the facts, mes amis. We have a man, dead in a locked room, a pistol, too far from his hand for suicide, and now a witness who claims to have seen the murder, but not the murderer. A paradox, non? Caldwell crossed his arms. It means she's either delusional or she's lying. Poirot stopped, turned. Or it means, he said quietly, that we are dealing with something far more clever than we first imagined. Lady Eleanor, who had remained silent for much of the discussion, spoke now. What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot turned his gaze back to Florence. Tell me, mademoiselle, he said softly. Are you certain beyond all doubt that you saw the gun? Florence's brow furrowed. Yes, she whispered. Think carefully. Did you see it fire? A pause. I heard the shot, she said, but now there was uncertainty in her voice. I saw the figure holding the gun. I saw Lord Ashford fall, but I don't remember seeing the moment the bullet left the weapon. Poirot smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Fascinating, he murmured. The others watched him, waiting. You see, mes amis, our witness has told us nothing but the truth, and yet what she saw was not the truth at all. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Florence's breath hitched. I don't understand. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You saw what you were meant to see, what someone wanted you to see. A slow dread crept into Florence's eyes. You mean, Poirot nodded, a deception, a manipulation, a trick of the mind. Tell me, mademoiselle, how much do you remember of the moments before you looked into the room? Florence's lips parted, but no words came. Perhaps you had been feeling lightheaded, Poirot continued. Perhaps you had been distracted by something, a sound, a scent. Perhaps you were unknowingly under the influence of something. Florence let out a sharp breath. The tea, she whispered. Lord Ashford gave me tea earlier that evening. He insisted I drink it. A hush fell over the room. Poirot's eyes gleamed with revelation. Then there, I believe, lies our answer. He exhaled. Mes amis, the witness saw nothing, because she was never meant to see anything at all. The room was thick with tension, a palpable weight settling into every corner. Florence's hands trembled. Then who? Poirot turned, his gaze falling upon each of them, his mind working through the puzzle. That, mademoiselle, he said quietly, is the final piece we have yet to uncover. Outside, the wind rattled against the glass once more, and somewhere, hidden in the depths of the house, the true killer waited. Chapter 4. the clue that defied logic. The storm outside had grown restless, rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside Blackwood Manor, the air was thick with tension. The study remained untouched since Lord Reginald Ashford's death, save for the presence of Hercule Poirot, who stood at the very centre of the crime scene, deep in thought. The others lingered outside, their hushed whispers carried by the draught that weaved through the dimly lit corridors. It had been 2 days since the murder, and yet every step in the investigation had only led to more confusion. A locked-room murder, a victim with no past, a witness who claimed to have seen a killer that was never there. But now, something new had surfaced, something that should not exist. Poirot's eyes were fixed on the desk, where Inspector Caldwell had placed the latest piece of evidence. A letter, a single sheet of paper, neatly folded, untouched by the chaos of the crime scene. It had been found inside Lord Ashford's safe, one that had been locked at the time of his death. The safe had to be forced open by the authorities, and yet the letter was dated precisely 2 days after the murder. The ink was fresh, the signature unmistakable. It was written by Lord Reginald Ashford himself. Caldwell paced near the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck. "It doesn't make sense, Poirot. The man was dead. He was dead when we found him. And yet, this letter is real. It's his handwriting, his seal." Poirot remained still, his expression unreadable. The letter had been addressed to Victor Hughes, the solicitor, a simple message. "By the time you read this, it will already be too late, but you must understand, I had no choice. What is done cannot be undone. Burn this letter. Forget you ever saw it." Victor Hughes had gone pale when the letter was read aloud. He had claimed ignorance, swore he had never seen it before, but his hands had trembled as they clutched the edges of the desk. Poirot had noticed. Florence Green, the ever-nervous assistant, had barely spoken. Lady Eleanor had only shaken her head, whispering that it was impossible, and Henry Ashford had simply laughed, a low, humorless sound. "Either my brother has pulled off the greatest trick of the century," he had said, "or someone here is trying very hard to make us believe in ghosts." Poirot finally reached for the letter. His fingers traced the ink, the paper, the faint smudge where a hurried hand had folded it. It was real. That much was certain. But the implications, they defied all reason. "Consider, mes amis," Poirot finally spoke, his voice measured. "A man writes a letter from beyond the grave. A message only discovered after the crime, locked away where no hand could place it. What does that tell us?" Caldwell exhaled. "It tells us that someone planted it. Someone forged it." Poirot turned his sharp gaze toward him. "Ah, but that would be too simple, no? The handwriting is an exact match. The ink, fresh. The seal, unbroken. No, mon ami, this is not merely a forgery. It is something much more deliberate." Victor Hughes shifted in his seat. "Then what are you suggesting, Poirot? That Lord Ashford was alive after we found him dead?" The thought settled over the room like a heavy fog. Poirot placed the letter down carefully. "Or perhaps, Monsieur Hughes, we must ask an even stranger question. If he was never truly alive to begin with." A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "That doesn't make any sense. I was married to him. I lived with him. Poirot raised a hand. "No, madame. You believed you did, and so did we all. But what if what we knew of Lord Reginald Ashford was nothing more than an illusion?" The room had grown colder. Or perhaps it was just the weight of realization sinking into the walls. Florence spoke then, her voice fragile. But the body, we saw him. He was there, dead. Poirot's mind worked through the puzzle, pieces falling into place in a way that both thrilled and disturbed him. "Tell me, Miss Green," Poirot said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "what do you remember of his body? His face, his hands, his eyes?" Florence frowned, as if trying to recall something just out of reach. I don't know. I remember the blood, the way he was slumped over. But his face..." She hesitated. "It's strange. I don't actually remember looking at his face." Caldwell stiffened. "You mean to say..." Poirot turned to him, nodding slightly. "The mind plays tricks, does it not? Especially when it is expected to see something. When we entered that room, when we saw that body, we assumed it was Lord Ashford. But what if it was not? What if it was never him at all?" The revelation crashed into the room like thunder. Henry Ashford was the first to react, standing abruptly. "Are you saying that the dead man in that room wasn't my brother?" Poirot met his gaze. "I am saying that we must ask ourselves why there is no record of Lord Reginald Ashford's past. Why no documents exist to prove his existence. Why a letter appears days after his supposed death. And why not a single person here can remember truly looking into the face of the corpse." Florence let out a sharp breath. "Then who was he?" Poirot turned back to the letter, running his fingers over the signature once more. "A shadow," he murmured. "A ghost given form for just long enough to be murdered." Caldwell cursed under his breath. "Then if it wasn't Lord Ashford, who the hell have we been investigating?" A silence stretched through the room, the weight of the questions settling in. Poirot exhaled slowly. "That, mon cher, is the true mystery. A man who never existed, a victim who left no trace, and now a letter written by a dead man. But somewhere in these walls, in these secrets, lies the one clue that will make sense of it all." The house groaned under the weight of the storm outside. The shadows lengthened as the candlelight flickered, and beyond the room, in the quiet corridors of Blackwood Manor, something, or someone, was watching. Chapter 5. A suspect with an impossible alibi. The grandfather clock in the study chimed once, a deep reverberating sound that seemed to echo through the hollow corridors of Blackwood Manor. Outside, the rain had finally ceased, leaving only the ghost of its presence in the form of damp mist that curled around the trees. The house had settled into a heavy stillness, a silence that carried the weight of unanswered questions. It was a silence Hercule Poirot despised. Silence meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant that the truth was still out of reach. He stood in the study, staring at the scattered case notes in front of him. The puzzle had begun to take shape, pieces falling into place with each revelation. But there was one piece that did not fit: a man with every reason to kill Lord Reginald Ashford, yet a perfect alibi that rendered it impossible. Henry Ashford, the estranged brother, the man who stood to gain the most from Reginald's death, the man who had openly despised him. He had been cold from the start, detached, almost too indifferent to his brother's murder. Poirot had seen it before, the mask of detachment worn by those who had already made their peace with the crime they had committed. And yet, there was one problem. Henry Ashford had been nowhere near Blackwood Manor at the time of the murder. Victor Hughes had sworn to it. Henry had been seen at his club in London, dining with colleagues. The entire staff at the Oakwood Gentlemen's Club could attest to his presence. There were receipts, witnesses, and a carriage driver who had confirmed that Henry had left the club just before midnight, hours after Lord Ashford had already been shot in his locked study. It was airtight, ironclad, and yet Poirot's instincts would not let it go. Alibis could be fabricated. Time could be manipulated. A man could be in two places at once if he knew how to play the game. Henry sat across from Poirot now, legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the chair, as if he were merely entertaining an old friend. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across his sharp, angular features. "You seem troubled, Monsieur Poirot," Henry mused, swirling the glass of whiskey in his hand. "You've solved half the mystery, but something still nags at you, doesn't it?" Poirot regarded him with quiet intensity. "Indeed. It is a most curious thing, Monsieur Ashford, when a man, with every reason to commit a crime, is also the one man who could not have possibly done it." Henry chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "That does seem to be quite the dilemma, doesn't it?" Poirot leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Tell me, Monsieur Ashford, what is it like to be completely free of suspicion?" A smirk tugged at Henry's lips. "Refreshing." The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound filling the space between them. Poirot studied him, watching for the flicker of deception, the crack in the carefully constructed facade. But Henry was unreadable, too controlled, too precise. "You hated your brother, non?" Poirot said after a moment. Henry let out a short laugh. "Hate is such a strong word. I preferred to think of it as mutual disdain. And yet, now that he is dead, you inherit everything." Henry raised an eyebrow. "I suppose I do. But if you think I killed him for it, you'll be sorely disappointed. I was in London, Poirot. You know this." Poirot leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then he said, almost idly, "Tell me, Monsieur Ashford, have you ever heard of a false alibi?" Henry's smirk faltered just slightly. "Just enough." "A false alibi?" "Oui," Poirot nodded. "It is a most clever thing. The trick is not to fabricate an alibi from nothing. No, that would be far too obvious. Instead, one simply ensures they are seen, their presence noted, but only in ways that can be easily manipulated." Henry exhaled, shaking his head with amusement. "This is entertaining, Poirot. Truly. But I was at my club in London. People saw me." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but when did they see you?" A pause. Poirot continued, his voice calm, measured. "The human memory is a most fragile thing, Monsieur Ashford. It does not recall exact moments, but rather impressions, feelings, vague recollections of time. A man at a club orders a drink. A man converses with his peers. But does anyone truly remember if it was precisely at 9, or if it was a recollection from an hour before? Would they notice if for just an hour you had vanished?" Henry's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. "That's quite the theory, Poirot, but you'd need proof." Poirot smiled, eyes glinting. "And I believe I have it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a single item, a small folded piece of paper. Henry's gaze flicked to it, curiosity flashing across his face. Poirot unfolded it with delicate precision and placed it on the table. A receipt. "The club's ledger, Monsieur Ashford," Poirot said, tapping the paper lightly. "Signed at 9:15 p.m., marking the time of your dinner. And yet, curiously, another signature appears, one for a carriage ride taken at 10:20 p.m. A carriage that left from a location not far from here." Henry's jaw tightened. Just for a second. Poirot's voice softened. You see, monsieur, I do not believe you were in London all evening. I believe you left just long enough to come here, commit the crime, and return before anyone noticed your absence. The weight of the accusation hung heavy in the air. Henry exhaled slowly, setting down his drink. You have quite the imagination, Poirot. Poirot only smiled. Perhaps, but I have one more question for you, Monsieur Ashford. Henry met his gaze. Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. Did you truly believe no one would notice the time on the pocket watch? Henry's fingers twitched. What pocket watch? Poirot leaned forward, lowering his voice. The one on the dead man's desk. Stopped at 10:30 p.m., a watch that had been in perfect working order hours before his death. A watch that you, in your hurry, forgot to wind back before locking the study door behind you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Henry's lips parted, as if to say something, but no words came. Poirot watched him, the final piece falling into place. He had been careful, meticulous, but the smallest mistake had betrayed him. Finally, Henry let out a slow, tired sigh. You really are as brilliant as they say, Poirot. Poirot said nothing. There was nothing more to say. The fire crackled once more, casting long shadows against the walls. The game was over. Chapter 6. The letter that arrived too late. The fire in the grand study had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows along the dark panelled walls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, smouldering wood, and something else, something unseen, something lurking beneath the surface of Blackwood Manor. Hercule Poirot sat in his usual composed manner, fingers delicately pressed together, but his mind was anything but still. A question gnawed at him, relentless and insistent, burrowing into the very heart of the case. A dead man had sent a letter, a warning from beyond the grave. But why had it come so late? The letter had been delivered that morning, sealed in an envelope, bearing the Ashford crest, the edges slightly worn, as if it had passed through many hands before reaching its intended recipient. It was addressed to Victor Hughes, the solicitor who had gone pale upon reading it, his hands trembling as he passed it to Poirot without a word. The ink was unmistakably that of Lord Reginald Ashford. The words, however, carried the weight of something far more chilling. By the time you read this, I will be dead. You must not trust them. Any of them. Nothing more. No name, no accusation, just that one stark message. A warning meant to arrive before the murder. And yet, it had arrived too late. Inspector Caldwell paced near the window, glancing back at Poirot. A clever trick, sending a letter after his own death. But it doesn't make sense. If he knew he was going to die, why not come straight to us? Why not leave something more concrete? Poirot tapped a finger lightly against the table. Perhaps, mon ami, because he did not know who to fear, only that he had reason to be afraid. Lady Eleanor Ashford sat stiffly in the corner, her expression unreadable, though her fingers twisted the fabric of her mourning dress. You think he suspected someone in this house? Poirot's gaze flickered to her. It would appear so, madame. And yet the timing is most intriguing, is it not? He turned his attention to Victor Hughes. Tell me, monsieur, when exactly was this letter posted? Victor hesitated. The postmark is dated 2 days ago, he said slowly. It should have arrived yesterday morning, but there was a delay, apparently. The postmaster said it had been misplaced, only found last night. A misplaced letter. Poirot's voice was thoughtful. How very convenient. Caldwell exhaled sharply. You think someone tampered with it? Poirot picked up the envelope, studying it carefully. Tampered, perhaps, or delayed intentionally. He turned the letter over, running his fingers along the edges. It is not merely the letter that interests me, mon cher. It is the timing. This letter was meant to reach Victor Hughes before the murder, and yet it did not. The question we must ask ourselves is, who benefits from such a delay? A hush fell over the room. The fire crackled, softly, filling the silence with a slow, rhythmic pop of burning wood. Henry Ashford, lounging in the corner with his usual air of amusement, let out a low chuckle. You make it sound as if someone knew the letter was coming and made sure it arrived too late. Poirot turned his sharp gaze to him. An interesting hypothesis, monsieur. Would you care to elaborate? Henry smirked. Only that you're grasping at ghosts. Perhaps my dear brother was simply paranoid. Perhaps he had enemies, elsewhere, ones that had nothing to do with this house. Ah, Poirot mused, and yet the letter was sent to Victor Hughes, not the police, not his friends in London, not his business partners, only to the man who handled his affairs, a man who, I believe, was meant to receive it before Reginald Ashford died. Victor's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I would have gone straight to the authorities if I had received it in time. Indeed, Poirot said softly, and perhaps that is why you did not. The weight of his words settled heavily in the air. Florence Green, who had remained silent for most of the discussion, suddenly shifted. What if, she hesitated, what if he didn't send it himself? All eyes turned to her. Caldwell frowned. What are you implying? Florence's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. I mean, what if Lord Ashford wrote the letter, but never had the chance to send it? What if someone else found it and sent it after he died, to throw us off? Poirot's gaze darkened with interest. A most intriguing possibility, mademoiselle. If so, then we must ask, who had access to his study in those final hours? Lady Eleanor's voice was quiet, almost distant. Anyone who was here that night. The realization hung over them, oppressive and suffocating. The suspects had not changed, but the nature of the crime had. Poirot leaned back, his fingers steepled together. Then, mes amis, we must ask ourselves, was this letter a warning or a deception? A log in the fireplace collapsed with a dull thud, sending embers spiraling into the air. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows with a restless urgency. Poirot exhaled slowly. There is only one way to know for certain. He rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping over the room. We must retrace his final hours, from the moment he wrote that letter to the moment he died. Somewhere in that gap lies the answer, and I intend to find it. The storm outside howled louder, as if in response. But the true storm, Poirot knew, was waiting within these very walls. Chapter 7. The reflection that shouldn't be there. The storm had not yet broken, but the air in Blackwood Manor was suffocating, thick with a tension that seemed to press against the very walls. Outside, the trees swayed violently, their twisted branches casting skeletal shadows against the rain-slicked windows. Inside, the fire crackled in the study, its flickering glow failing to chase away the cold that had settled in the bones of those within. Poirot stood at the center of it all, unmoving, unblinking, his sharp mind dissecting every detail of the room with surgical precision. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect composition. And then, there it was, the thing that should not be, a reflection. He had only glanced at the mirror in passing, the great gilded frame stretching from floor to ceiling, an imposing presence in the otherwise somber room. It had stood there for decades, a relic of a time when the manor was alive with opulence instead of suspicion. But something in its surface had caught Poirot's eye, something that did not belong. He turned, his gaze narrowing. The mirror reflected the room as it was. The fireplace, the heavy desk, the ornate chandelier hanging from the ceiling, the bookshelves, the scattered case notes. But then his eyes locked onto it. A shadow, faint, almost imperceptible, standing just behind Lady Eleanor, who sat stiffly in her chair, fingers twitching at the edge of her mourning dress. A figure just beyond her shoulder, motionless. The others were gathered across the room, accounted for. There should have been no one there. Poirot's breath was slow, measured, as he stepped forward. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, addressing Lady Eleanor without shifting his gaze from the mirror. "Do not move." Her head snapped up, startled. "What?" "Do not move," Poirot repeated, his voice calm but firm. His eyes remained on the mirror. The shadow had not shifted. It was there, fixed, waiting. The others turned, following Poirot's gaze. Caldwell's brow furrowed. "What are you looking at, Poirot?" Poirot took another step, angling himself toward the mirror. And then, in an instant, the shadow disappeared. His breath caught in his throat. It was gone. He spun on his heel, scanning the room, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dim glow of candlelight and the unreadable expressions of those watching him. Lady Eleanor's voice trembled. "What did you see?" Poirot turned back to the mirror, studying its surface with renewed focus. It had been no trick of the light, no mere illusion. He had seen it, a figure that did not belong. And yet, in the room itself, there was nothing but empty space. His mind worked swiftly, rearranging the puzzle in real time. If the shadow had been visible in the mirror, but not in the room, what did that mean? What was the mirror reflecting that the naked eye could not see? Caldwell crossed his arms. "Poirot, you're starting to worry me. What exactly did you see?" Poirot exhaled. "A presence," he murmured. "A figure that should not be here." Henry Ashford let out a quiet chuckle, though there was something uneasy in his expression. "A ghost, Poirot? You, of all people, chasing phantoms?" Poirot ignored him, stepping closer to the mirror. He ran his fingers along the gilded frame, the intricate carvings beneath his touch, cold and unyielding. Then he pressed against the glass. It was solid, untouched, and yet it had revealed something the room had not. A thought struck him suddenly, a memory. Mirrors did not always reveal what was before them. Sometimes they reflected something behind them. His pulse quickened. He turned away from the mirror and studied the wall opposite it. The heavy bookshelves, the rows of neatly stacked volumes, the dust that had settled in places no hand had touched in years. Poirot turned to Caldwell. "Inspector, I require a ladder." Caldwell blinked. "A ladder?" Poirot's voice was sharper now, urgent. "Yes, at once." The ladder was brought in moments later, and Poirot wasted no time climbing to the highest shelf. His fingers traced the edges of the books, searching, feeling. And then, there, a small gap, barely noticeable. His heart pounded. He pressed against the shelf, Nothing, but he had felt it. The tiniest shift of air, the faintest suggestion of space where there should have been none. Poirot descended swiftly. He turned to Caldwell. "This bookshelf," he said, "has not always been here." Caldwell frowned. "You think there's something behind it?" Poirot nodded. "I do not think, mon ami. I know." It took the combined effort of Caldwell and two officers to move the heavy bookcase. Dust filled the air, thick and choking, as the forgotten space behind it was revealed. A door. A hidden door, sealed, away behind decades of forgotten literature. Florence Green gasped. Lady Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Henry Ashford, for once, was silent. Poirot stepped forward, his fingers brushing over the old wood. He could hear his own heartbeat. This was it, the thing that had eluded him, the missing piece, the truth hiding in plain sight. He pressed against the door, and with a low groan, it opened. Beyond it lay a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single person. The air was stale, untouched for years, but at the end of the passage, something gleamed in the dim candlelight. A silver tray. Poirot stepped forward, picking it up, and there, nestled in the dust, lay a delicate porcelain teacup, one identical to those used in the study. The rim was stained with dried residue. Poirot's eyes darkened. "Poison," he murmured. A murmur of shock swept through the room. Poirot turned back to the others, his expression grim. "This passage leads directly to the study," he said. "It was used that night by someone who knew of its existence, someone who poisoned Lord Ashford's drink before the gunshot ever rang out." Florence shook her head. "But we heard the shot. We saw—" Poirot's gaze settled on her. "Did you?" She hesitated. "Or did you only hear what you were meant to?" The final realization settled over the room, like a suffocating weight. The gunshot had been a ruse, a distraction. Lord Ashford had been dead long, before the trigger was ever pulled. The killer had used the passage to administer the poison, then staged the scene to appear as a shooting. But they had not accounted for one thing: the mirror. The reflection had revealed the truth, even when no one else had seen it. Poirot exhaled slowly, turning to the assembled faces before him. "And now, mes amis, the final act begins, because the killer is still among us, and they are running out of shadows to hide in." The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and in the silence that followed, the truth loomed, waiting to be unmasked. Chapter 8. The crime scene that moved. The wind howled against the manor, rattling the ancient windows as if something unseen wanted desperately to get inside. The night had not yet given way to dawn, and the storm clouds above swallowed the moon, leaving Blackwood Manor in an eerie half-darkness. Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold of Lord Reginald Ashford's study, his gloved hand resting against the heavy wooden door. It had been days since the murder, yet an unmistakable tension still clung to this place. A crime had been committed here, a crime that should not have been possible. But as Poirot stepped inside, he was met with something even more unsettling. The room was wrong. At first glance, everything appeared as it had that night. The grand mahogany desk remained at the center. The fireplace still crackled weakly. The bookshelves towered in their usual dust-laden silence. But something had changed. Poirot could feel it before he could see it, like an unseen force shifting just beyond his periphery. He stepped further inside, eyes scanning every inch with practiced precision. It was subtle, painfully subtle. A book slightly out of place. A chair angled differently. The ink blotter on the desk turned ever so slightly counterclockwise. Small things, meaningless things. And yet Poirot knew better than to dismiss them. Someone had been here. Someone had returned to the scene of the crime and disturbed it. But why? Inspector, Caldwell followed him inside, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. You look like a man who has just seen a ghost, Poirot. Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt near the desk, running a finger along the polished surface. It was clean, too clean, as if it had been wiped down recently. He straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me, mon ami," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "who has had access to this room since the night of the murder?" Caldwell exhaled. "Other than myself and my men, the house staff, Lady Eleanor has been in here once, Henry Ashford twice. Florence Green, the assistant, came looking for some papers. Why?" Poirot's fingers ghosted over the armrest of the chair, feeling for something unseen. "Because, mon cher, someone has tried to erase something." Caldwell frowned. "You think they were looking for evidence?" "No," Poirot murmured. "I think they were trying to undo something." He turned toward the fireplace. The embers had nearly died, but the faint scent of something burnt still lingered. Poirot stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the rug. He crouched down, lifting a single burnt fragment from the ashes. Paper, not entirely disintegrated, but close. He turned it over between his fingers. A single letter was visible at the very edge of the scorched scrap, and Caldwell peered over his shoulder. A name. Perhaps, Poirot mused, or a word. Either way, it was not meant to be found. He turned back to the desk, eyes lingering on the drawers. His mind whirred like a clock, tracing the timeline of the murder, the sequence of events, the pieces that didn't fit. Something had been changed in this room, something important. Then his gaze landed on the carpet. A slow realization crept over him. Poirot took a step back, tilting his head. The carpet beneath the desk, the same dark, intricate pattern that had been there for years, looked untouched, and yet something nagged at him, a whisper of a memory. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, picturing the room as it had been that night. The body, the blood, the chair, the placement of every object. Then he opened his eyes. "The rug has been moved." Caldwell's brow furrowed. "What?" Poirot took another step back, gesturing toward the floor. "It is subtle, mon ami. A fraction of an inch, but it is not as it was." Caldwell glanced down. "You're telling me someone came back, just to shift a rug?" Poirot inhaled slowly. "Not just that. They moved something beneath it." His voice carried an edge of certainty now. He knelt, his hands pressing against the edge of the rug. With deliberate care, he lifted it. A collective breath hitched in the air. Beneath the rug, just barely peeking out from the wooden floorboards, was a seam. A thin, deliberate break in the planks, forming the outline of a square. A hidden compartment. The room fell utterly silent. Poirot exchanged a look with Caldwell. Then, with careful precision, he pressed against the edges. The wood creaked, resistant at first, then gave way with a muted click. The hidden panel lifted. Inside, in the shallow space beneath the floor, lay a single item, a gun. But not the same gun that had been found near Lord Ashford's body. A second weapon. The air seemed to thicken. Caldwell's hand went instinctively to his holster. Poirot, however, remained perfectly still, his mind spiraling through the implications. The crime scene had changed because someone had been trying to correct a mistake. Someone had hidden this gun after the initial investigation, knowing that if it were discovered, the truth would unravel. Poirot reached in, lifting the weapon delicately. The metal was cool, untouched by the warmth of the room. His fingers ghosted over the barrel, the grip. It was clean, too clean. A realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The first gun, the one found at the scene, had always been a decoy, a carefully placed deception. But this was the real murder weapon. He turned to Caldwell, his voice steady but low. "This changes everything." Caldwell exhaled, running a hand over his face. "So the gun we found, it was planted." Poirot confirmed, "a distraction, a way to frame the crime as something it was not, and whoever moved this gun, they did so after the murder." A creeping sense of unease settled in. The killer was still here, somewhere in Blackwood Manor, and they had not yet finished covering their tracks. Poirot set the gun down carefully, his mind racing. "We must move swiftly, Inspector. The truth is slipping through our fingers, and I fear we are running out of time." Caldwell nodded, his expression grim. "What now?" Poirot turned toward the door, his posture rigid, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Now, mon ami, we set a trap." The fire crackled. The storm outside raged on, and somewhere within the shadows of Blackwood Manor, the killer watched, waiting. Chapter 9. The Man Who Died Twice. The rain had not let up for days, drumming against the windows of Blackwood Manor like impatient fingers demanding entry. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the ancient glass panes as if whispering secrets only the dead could understand. Inside the grand study, Hercule Poirot sat motionless in a chair, eyes fixed on the lifeless body sprawled before him. Lord Reginald Ashford, murdered, shot through the temple, found slumped over his desk. It was an image he had replayed in his mind 100 times. And yet, in that moment, as a single candle flickered against the gloom, Poirot felt something he had never felt before. Doubt. The case had been puzzling enough. A locked room murder. A victim with no verifiable past. A letter that had arrived too late. But now, there was something else. Something that threatened to unravel everything. The records. Inspector Caldwell had stormed into the manor earlier that evening. His face, pale beneath his usual gruff exterior. In his hands, he held a folder, the edges worn as if it had been handled too many times in too short a period. Without a word, he had placed it on the desk before Poirot. "Tell me I'm seeing things," Caldwell had said, his voice low. Poirot had opened the folder, his fingers skimming over the crisp sheets of paper inside. What he found there had sent an unmistakable chill down his spine. A death certificate, issued 3 years ago, for Lord Reginald Ashford, the very man who now lay dead. Before them had, according to official records, already died once before. The silence in the room had been suffocating. Poirot had read the document twice, 3 times, looking for an error, a forgery, something that might explain the impossible. But there was no mistake. The certificate was genuine. Stamped, dated, signed. 3 years prior, in a quiet London hospital, Lord Reginald Ashford had been declared deceased. The cause? A sudden illness. And yet, here he was. Shot. Murdered. Again. The implications settled heavily in Poirot's mind. If Lord Ashford had truly died 3 years ago, then who was the man they had just buried? Caldwell had been pacing furiously. "How the hell does a man die twice, Poirot?" Poirot had not answered then. He could not. The question was maddening, the logic of it slipping through his fingers like smoke. But now, as he stared at the dead man's lifeless face once more, a single, unshakable thought pressed itself into his mind. Perhaps Lord Reginald Ashford had never truly existed at all. He rose from his chair, moving with slow, deliberate steps. The study felt colder now, the weight of an unseen presence settling over the air. He studied the body, the way it had been positioned, the way the blood had pooled, the way every detail seemed placed, staged. Poirot's fingers ghosted over the pocket watch, still clutched in the corpse's rigid hand. The time had been stopped at the exact moment of death. But was it truly the moment he had died, or merely the moment someone had wanted them to believe he had? A noise from behind made Poirot turn. Florence Green stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her face drawn with unease. "Monsieur Poirot," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper, I think I may have done something terribly wrong." Poirot regarded her carefully. "What is it, mademoiselle?" Florence swallowed hard. "I was sorting through some of Lord Ashford's personal letters, and I found this." She stepped forward, holding out a small, yellowed envelope. Poirot took it, his pulse quickening. Inside was a letter, dated 4 years ago, signed by a different name entirely. "My dearest Eleanor, the doctors say I do not have long. I will not fight it. I have been running all my life, and perhaps this is the end of my escape. But please, if something should happen to me, do not let them bury me under my real name. I do not want them to find me. Let me be Lord Reginald Ashford." Poirot's hands tightened around the paper. A name change. A deliberate deception. The man they knew as Lord Reginald Ashford was not Lord Ashford at all. Florence's voice trembled. Who was he? Poirot inhaled slowly. Someone who lived a life not his own. He turned back to the body, realization slamming into him with a force that nearly took his breath away. And someone who was being hunted because of it. The truth was grotesque in its elegance. 3 years ago, a man had died in a London hospital. A man with no family, no wealth, no legacy. And so, another had taken his name. The real Lord Reginald Ashford had been long dead. But this impostor had assumed his identity, slipping into a life of wealth and comfort without suspicion. Until now, someone had discovered the lie. Someone had come to Blackwood Manor to correct it. Poirot turned sharply to Caldwell. This was not simply a murder, mon ami. It was an execution. Caldwell's expression darkened. Who would kill a man just for stealing a name? Poirot's mind was already running through the possibilities. An old enemy, a debt collector, a betrayal that had festered for years, and yet something deeper gnawed at him. This was not just about a stolen identity. It was about who that man had been before he became Lord Ashford. Florence's voice wavered. Do you think the real Lord Ashford's family ever knew the truth? Poirot looked at her carefully. No, mademoiselle, I do not. He turned back to the body once more. The impostor had thought he had buried his past, thought he had erased the man he used to be. But the past was relentless. It always found its way back, and this time it had come with a bullet. Poirot exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. The dead do not return, mon ami, but their secrets, they never stay buried. And somewhere in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, someone was still watching. Someone who had known the truth all along. Chapter 10. a truth too terrible to believe. The storm had finally broken, but the night still carried an eerie stillness. The air was thick with the remnants of rain, the scent of damp earth clinging to the heavy velvet drapes of Blackwood Manor. A single candle flickered in the grand study, its wavering light casting distorted shadows on the walls, stretching and shifting like unseen figures lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Poirot stood in the center of it all, his small, precise hands resting on the edge of the great mahogany desk where Lord Reginald Ashford had been found dead. The weight of the case, of the impossibility of it all, pressed against his chest like an iron hand. A man who had already died once had been murdered again. A hidden gun, a false identity, a letter that arrived too late. And now, as Poirot sifted through the final remnants of deception, the truth was beginning to surface. But it was a truth that made no sense. Not yet. Inspector Caldwell, ever the skeptic, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. His sharp eyes flickered between Poirot and the collection of papers strewn across the desk. "You have that look again, Poirot," he muttered. Poirot didn't glance up. "What look is that, mon ami?" "The one you get when you're about to say something absolutely ridiculous, but somehow you'll end up being right." Poirot allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Then perhaps, Inspector, you should prepare yourself." Caldwell sighed, shaking his head. "Go on, then. Tell me what impossible theory you've managed to piece together." Poirot lifted a single document from the desk. The death certificate of Lord Reginald Ashford, the first one, stamped, dated, and signed 3 years ago, and beside it, a second document, the death certificate of the man they had buried just days ago, identical in every way, the same name, the same age, the same identity, but not the same man. "This is not a case of murder alone," Poirot murmured. "It is a case of erasure." Florence Green, sitting nervously in the corner, clutched her shawl closer around her shoulders. "Erasure?" she echoed. Poirot's dark eyes flicked to her. "Someone did not simply kill Lord Ashford. They tried to erase him, and they nearly succeeded." Caldwell let out a frustrated sigh. "All right, Poirot, I'll bite. Why would someone go through all the trouble of killing a man who was already dead?" Poirot's fingers tapped against the papers, his mind racing through every clue, every deception, every missing piece. "Because, mon cher, he was not the man he claimed to be. You saw it yourself. The real Lord Reginald Ashford died in London 3 years ago. The man who took his place stole his name, his wealth, his life. But there is one thing he could never steal." Poirot lifted his gaze, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "His past." A hush fell over the room. Henry Ashford, standing near the fireplace, let out a low, humorless chuckle. "So, what are you saying, Poirot? That the man we thought was my brother was nothing more than an impostor?" "Oui," Poirot said, "but that, mon ami, is not the most terrible truth." The fire crackled. The storm outside had quieted, but the tension in the study had thickened, suffocating. Poirot reached for another piece of paper. This one yellowed, old, brittle with time. A letter, one that had been hidden away for years, found tucked inside the false Lord Ashford's personal belongings. He held it up, his voice steady but laced with something unreadable. "This," he said, "is a confession." Florence inhaled sharply. Caldwell straightened. The room felt impossibly small. Poirot unfolded the paper, his gaze skimming over the inked words. written by the man we believe to be Lord Reginald Ashford, addressed to no one. It speaks of a crime, a murder, a debt long overdue. It speaks of running from the past, of taking a new name, of burying an old life beneath a new one. His voice softened, and it speaks of someone coming to find him. Lady Eleanor's breath caught. Someone coming? Poirot's gaze was sharp, precise. He knew someone had discovered the truth. He knew they would come to finish what they started 3 years ago. He was not merely murdered, mes amis. Poirot exhaled. He was hunted. The implications sent a shiver down Florence's spine. Caldwell rubbed his temples. Let me get this straight. This impostor, whoever he really was, knew he was a dead man walking. Poirot nodded. Oui. And he still stayed here? Poirot's expression darkened. Because, mon ami, I suspect he did not know who was coming for him. A silence settled. Henry Ashford's smirk had faded. So you're saying the killer could have been any of us? Poirot met his gaze. Or someone we have not yet considered. Florence suddenly let out a soft, shaky breath. The letter. Her hands trembled. The one that arrived too late. He warned us not to trust anyone. Was he right? Poirot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the desk, his fingers grazing over the second death certificate once more. There was still something missing. A piece of the puzzle not yet found. But then, the final realization struck. He inhaled sharply, his mind clicking into place. Mon Dieu! Caldwell stiffened. What is it? Poirot turned, his expression unreadable. There was no impostor. The room froze. Lady Eleanor whispered, What? Poirot's voice was barely above a breath. Because the man who died 3 years ago was not the real Lord Reginald Ashford. A collective gasp. Poirot continued, his voice gaining strength. They switched places. The real Lord Ashford vanished, disappeared into obscurity, and the man who took his place assumed his identity not to steal his wealth, but to protect him. Florence covered her mouth. Caldwell's eyes widened. Henry's face paled. Poirot exhaled. And now, mes amis, the true Lord Ashford, wherever he is, knows his protector is dead. His voice was solemn, and he will come back to finish what was started. The wind howled, and somewhere, in the depths of the manor, a shadow moved. Chapter 11. The final clue, hidden in plain sight. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a suffocating stillness that settled over Blackwood Manor like a thick, heavy fog. The rain had washed away the footprints in the gravel driveway, but inside the house, the echoes of deceit still lingered in every darkened corner, in every flickering candlelight that cast long, stretching shadows. Poirot stood alone in the grand study, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an intensity that only came when he was on the edge of revelation. The others had left for the night, their alibis rattling around in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The murderer was here, had always been here, and yet every clue, every contradiction had led them in circles. But there was something so small, so inconsequential, that everyone had overlooked it. Everyone except him. The study was silent. The bloodstains had long since dried on the carpet where Lord Reginald Ashford had been found. The desk was as it had been, papers stacked neatly, a single unlit cigar resting in the brass tray, a clock ticking softly in the background. The pocket watch, still clutched in the dead man's hand, had been stopped at the precise moment of death. And yet, Poirot's gaze did not rest on the body, nor on the staged crime scene. His focus was elsewhere, on the ordinary. His fingers ghosted over the rim of an empty teacup, a seemingly harmless object, a piece of the setting, insignificant in the grander scheme of things. But Poirot knew better. It had been there from the start, overlooked, ignored, because a teacup belonged in a study, did it not? A man of Lord Ashford's stature might sit at his desk, sip from his tea, conduct his business as usual. Except this cup had been full on the night of the murder, and now it was empty. Poirot's heartbeat quickened. It had not been cleaned away, not removed like so many of the other details that had been tampered with in the room. It had simply been emptied, quietly, without drawing attention. Someone had finished the tea. His fingers tightened around the porcelain. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. The real murder had not been the gunshot. It had never been the gunshot. Lord Ashford had been dead before the pistol had ever been fired. The killer had known exactly how to stage it, exactly how to throw the investigation off course, but they had made a mistake, a tiny, insignificant mistake. They had left the cup. A body does not drink its own tea after it has been shot. Poirot turned sharply, his mind racing through the events of that night with newfound clarity. The locked room, the missing records, the letter that arrived too late, the gun hidden beneath the floorboards. It had all been meant to mislead. A smokescreen for the truth. The tea had been poisoned. That was the true moment of death. Someone in this house had handed Lord Ashford his final drink. And then, after ensuring he was beyond saving, they had fired the gun to stage the crime as something else entirely. They had fooled them all, except now Poirot knew. His pulse thrummed as he stepped out of the study, the hallway stretching before him like a tunnel, leading him straight to the killer. The house had not yet settled for the night. Somewhere, beyond the doors and the dimly lit corridors, the murderer waited. Poirot found them in the drawing room. Lady Eleanor sat by the fireplace, her back perfectly straight, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the embers. She did not startle when he entered, did not turn to meet his gaze. "You know, don't you?" she murmured. Poirot exhaled. "Oui, madame." A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Lady Eleanor's fingers traced the edge of the porcelain saucer before her, identical to the one in the study. The same delicate pattern, the same insignia of Blackwood Manor. Poirot stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You poisoned him?" Her lips pressed together. "Yes." There was no fear in her voice, no panic, only the calm acceptance of a woman who had waited too long for this moment. Poirot watched her carefully. "Why?" Lady Eleanor's grip on the saucer tightened. "Because the man you call Lord Reginald Ashford was a fraud." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something dark, something filled with years of resentment. "He was not my husband. He was not the man I married. And yet, he sat in my house, at my table, in my bed, pretending." Poirot's chest tightened. The truth had begun to surface in the previous chapter, but hearing it from her lips cemented it. "You knew." "From the beginning," she whispered. He studied her. "And yet, you did nothing." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "What was there to do, Monsieur Poirot? He had the papers, the name, the wealth. Who would believe me? A grieving widow, clinging to a ghost?" Poirot remained silent. Lady Eleanor turned her gaze to the fire, her expression unreadable. He took everything. He erased the real Reginald, and I let him. Her hands trembled slightly, until I couldn't any more. Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. And so, you made a choice. She exhaled, her breath slow, measured. I did not kill him out of rage, Monsieur Poirot. I killed him because I was afraid. Poirot's brows furrowed. Afraid? Lady Eleanor's grip on the saucer was so tight now that Poirot feared it might crack beneath her fingers. I was afraid of what he had done, of who he truly was. You see, Monsieur Poirot, you assumed he was simply a man running from his past. Poirot inhaled sharply. But he was something far worse, wasn't he? She turned to meet his gaze, and for the first time, he saw it, the sheer terror in her eyes. He wasn't just running, Monsieur Poirot. He was hiding. A cold dread seeped into Poirot's veins. What did he do, Lady Eleanor? Her lips trembled. I don't know, but I knew that someone was coming for him. The realization crashed into Poirot like a violent wave. Lord Ashford, or whoever he had been, had not just stolen a name. He had stolen something bigger, something powerful, something that had made him a marked man. Lady Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. He wasn't killed for what he did here. He was killed for something he did long before. A silence settled between them. The fire crackled. The wind outside had begun to rise again. Poirot straightened, his mind reeling. The murderer had been found. But the case was not yet over, because somewhere beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor, the real threat was still out there. And they were coming. Chapter 12. The Murderer Who Was Never There. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of Blackwood Manor as if trying to claw its way inside. The storm had broken, but the air remained thick with something unseen, something that clung to the walls, the furniture, the very breath of those still trapped within its shadows. In the grand study, the air was damp with the remnants of the fire, smoke curling lazily toward the high ceilings. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled guests, his expression unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. The time for deception had ended. He had seen it now, the final piece, the truth that had been lurking in the periphery of every clue, every contradiction, every step of this impossible case. And it was a truth so terrible, so absurd, that even Poirot himself had hesitated before accepting it. The others watched him in tense silence. Henry Ashford stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his usual smirk absent for once. Lady Eleanor sat stiffly in an armchair, fingers curled around the armrest as though bracing herself for impact. Florence Green, trembling, clutched her shawl as though it could shield her from whatever revelation was about to fall from Poirot's lips. Caldwell, his jaw clenched, remained by the door, one hand resting instinctively near the revolver at his hip. And yet, there was no killer in this room. Poirot took a breath. There has been a mistake, he said softly. A grand deception, yes, but not one committed by any of you. Henry scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, come now, Poirot. If this is the part where you tell us no one actually murdered my brother— Poirot raised a hand, cutting him off. Not quite, Monsieur Ashford. His voice was quiet, controlled. A murder was committed, but it was not the work of a man, nor a woman, nor a shadow slipping through the corridors of Blackwood Manor. A silence stretched, thick and heavy. Poirot's eyes swept the room. The murderer, mes amis, was never here at all. Florence gasped. Caldwell frowned. Lady Eleanor's breath hitched. Henry let out a dry, incredulous laugh. You expect us to believe the man shot himself? A locked-room suicide and a poisoning? Come now, Poirot. I thought you had more imagination than that. Poirot turned to him, his dark eyes sharp as glass. No, Monsieur Ashford. Lord Reginald Ashford did not kill himself, nor did anyone else. The crime you see before you was an illusion, a grand trick, a perfect deception. And the greatest trick of all? He paused, voice lowering. The victim created his own murderer. The room fell into stunned silence. Florence let out a quiet, shaky breath. I don't understand. Poirot moved toward the desk, where the scene of the crime had been frozen in time. Consider what we know. A man shot at close range, in a locked study, a letter sent to warn of his impending death, a false identity, a past erased, and yet no footsteps, no fingerprints, no trace of an intruder. Only a story, whispered in the corridors of this house, a shadow in the mirror, a presence that no one could ever prove existed. Tell me, mes amis. Poirot turned, his voice dropping to a near whisper. What if the victim had been running from someone who was never truly there? Florence's hand flew to her mouth. Caldwell exhaled sharply. You're saying he imagined his own killer? Poirot nodded. It is the only explanation that fits. Consider the evidence. From the moment we arrived, we have chased a phantom, a figure that left no mark, no proof of their existence. And yet, Lord Ashford himself was certain that someone was coming for him, that he was being hunted. He was so certain that he left behind a letter begging us not to trust anyone. Poirot's voice softened. But what if that letter was not meant for us? What if it was a plea to himself, a desperate attempt to hold on to reality as it slipped from his grasp? Lady Eleanor's fingers dug into the armrest, her voice barely above a whisper. You mean to say he went mad? Poirot hesitated. Perhaps, or perhaps he was made to believe he was being hunted. Caldwell stiffened. You think someone wanted him to lose his mind? Poirot exhaled. I believe that whoever Lord Ashford truly was before he took this name, before he assumed this life, was a man with many enemies. But the most powerful enemy of all, mon cher, is fear itself. The words hung in the air. Poirot turned back to the desk, running his fingers over the worn edges of the pocket watch, the same watch that had been stopped at the exact time of death. He was made to believe he was being watched, followed, stalked, that at any moment the past he had buried would rise from the grave and claim him. And in the end, he saw what he had been conditioned to see. Florence's breath hitched. Are you saying there was never a killer? Poirot's voice was solemn. There was a murderer, mademoiselle, but they did not pull the trigger. They did not poison the tea. They did not break into this house under cover of night. He turned, gaze sweeping over the stunned faces before him. No, mes amis, they were far cleverer than that. They planted a single, terrible idea. They let time do the rest. They let the victim murder himself. A silence stretched so deep it seemed to swallow the room whole. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Lord Ashford's death was not a simple crime. It was the result of a plan so precise, so insidious, that it required no action at all. Only whispers, a misplaced letter, a shadow in the mirror, the faintest hint of a presence that did not exist, until, at last, the victim himself believed in it so entirely that he became his own executioner. Lady Eleanor's hands trembled. But the gun, Poirot nodded. He did not intend to die by his own hand. That much is clear. The gun was staged, the poison already taking hold. Perhaps in his final moments, he believed he was fighting back against his phantom killer. Poirot exhaled slowly. But there was no one there. Henry's voice was barely a whisper. Then who did this to him? Poirot turned away from the desk, his expression unreadable. That, mon ami, is the true crime. His voice lowered. And the true murderer still walks free. The candlelight flickered. The air in the room grew impossibly still. And for the first time, Blackwood Manor seemed to breathe. Because somewhere, beyond the confines of this house, beyond the ghosts of its past, someone, somewhere, was still watching. And they would strike again.